Okay, well, y'all already got a chance to talk with Daniel a little bit there. So I'll let him tell you his story. You guys can ask questions and all that, but it's a really interesting story about how he and his family came to the United States from Venezuela. So listen up, you guys will enjoy it. So Daniel, all yours.
You can pass the next slide. Yeah, I know it's black, that's fine, or, yeah. Do you guys remember the last time you went to a grocery store? I imagine you go with your parents or by yourselves and buy something. The last time I went to the grocery store was actually online. I live in the New York City area, and I buy almost all my groceries on Walmart, and they just shipped it literally to my front door, and it's really, really cool, you know. But that's a very different experience, and I'm sure your experience was also very different from the experience I used to have when I lived in Venezuela. While here you can go, and if you spend a long time in the grocery store, you do so simply because you're looking around and you're trying to decide. When you're in the cereal aisle, I'm sure that you guys have so many choices that you can't even see them all. Like, there's just simply no time to pick the cereal among all of them. You have to just make a quick choice or based on the things that you already buy. In Venezuela, it's the opposite. In Venezuela, we spent a lot of time in the grocery store, but not because we had too much choice, but because we had no choice. Because in Venezuela, the experience of going to a grocery store is empty aisles. It's lines of an hour, 2 hours of you say you need toilet paper for your family, the cashier telling you, I'm sorry, you can only take one per person. Or simply, you know, my favorite of the examples is as the rationing system got even worse, what happened was that they started putting fingerprint machines in the grocery stores. So that, you know, your fingerprint to identify you, that everybody has a unique fingerprint, you have to scan it. And based on that scan, the government would identify you in the computer, the cashier really, and the cashier would tell you how much left you had of your quota to buy things that week. This is what life used to be like in Venezuela. And we can go to the next slide. Pictures like this one, you know, a grocery store that is half empty, with the things that are available are actually things that you don't need. You know, like maybe there's a lot of cereal one week, but there's no meat. Or there's no, you know, chicken, or there's no something else. Female hygiene products, tires for your car if you go to something to change your car tire. All of those things disappeared. You can go to the next one. Venezuela, in case you don't know, is the country with the largest oil reserves in the planet. You know, oil is what gasoline is made of. It's what the roads are actually paved with. It all comes from oil. It's plastic. All the plastic bottles come from oil. Yet, despite us having the largest oil reserves in the planet, people have to line up for hours to get gasoline in their cars. People even have had to line up the whole night. Like, they just have to park their car in the middle of the street and wait, sleeping in their car, until the next morning when there will be gasoline in the gas station. That's not something that you worry about when you're here. You worry about, like, you know, oh, you know, I haven't filled up my gas in a very long time. I'm running out of gas. But you're not running out because there's no gas. You're just running out because you haven't gone to the gas station. That's the opposite experience in Venezuela. And as a consequence of this and many other things that I'm going to tell you about right now, Venezuelans are actually the largest refugee crisis in the planet right now. There are more Venezuelans outside of our own country than Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, than Syrians outside of Syria. Well, that's not something that usually people know about, right? Because in Syria and Ukraine, there are wars, violent wars, where people have been killed, where there are bombs. There's even use of chemical weapons that poison people's lungs. Yet, in Venezuela, without the need of any war, no civil war, no international war, no bombings of any country, more people have fled Venezuela than war zones. Why would that happen, right? But Venezuela didn't used to be this way. Venezuela used to actually be a pretty prosperous country. In the 1950s, Venezuela was the fourth richest country by GDP per capita in the world. That is how much the economy produces, based on its population. Not only was it the fourth richest country in the world, but Venezuelans, actually in Caracas, the capital city where I'm from, there were more cars per person in Caracas than in New York City. A cashier or an office worker or a construction worker in Caracas in the 50s and 60s used to make more money based on US dollars, when you change our currency to the dollar, than a similar person in the United States. I learned this actually recently because I was in my university and I looked for books about Venezuela, and there was this book about something like the Venezuela, the Dreamland, or the American Dream in Venezuela, something like that it was called. And it was by some Americans who had traveled to Venezuela and documented all these statistics of Venezuela, and I compared it to the statistics of the US, and it was incredible. To think that a country was richer than the United States by some measures in the 1950s, and now is one of the poorest countries in the world. That's something to think, how does that happen? And so that picture that you see right there is Caracas in the 1950s. Looks like a normal city, could even have been an American city. Savoy, which now owns by Nestlé, that it's a chocolate company, the big sign over there. My grandparents, along with millions of other people from all over the world, immigrated to Venezuela in the 1950s. My grandfather you can continue for the next one too. My grandfather from my mom's side, the man in the right, he opened a parking garage for cars, where people would pay for per hour, and they would park it in my grandpa's business. And he was able to save half of his income. Of course, he lived a very humble life, because that's the only way to save half of your income. But for somebody who didn't even have a high school education, saving half of your income is incredible. He saved half of his income, not because he just wanted to save for himself or invest for the future, but because he was sending money back home to Spain, where he was from. Because you see, Spain had gone through a civil war when he was born. He was actually left orphan because his father died in the Spanish Civil War. And he was sending money back home to his 7 siblings and mother who were back in Spain under, by the way, a fascist dictatorship in Spain that lasted until the 1980s. And so to think that somebody could come from a foreign country without any type of education and open a business and save half of their income, this was not an anomaly in Venezuela. Venezuela used to be the place where people could achieve their dreams. But it was not just him. From my dad's side, my grandfather, that's a picture of him at 17, he was making shoes. And, shoes per pair, selling them. Also, that was the only thing he really knew how to do, aside from, like the basic things. He also didn't finish elementary school. And he was able to, support his family, all of this so much that both my parents were able to go to college. Imagine, just in one generation, Venezuela became so much wealthier in one generation. And as a result, the truth is that I was blessed with an amazing family. Family that, we loved each other. We were not a very large family, but we had our traditions. This is a picture of me back when I was 10 years old. I'm the little kid with the white shirt in the middle. And then in the right is what we used to do, which was tomato sauce. Like as a family tradition, we bought a lot of tomatoes. That's something that we had to stop doing, because then we couldn't buy all those tomatoes anymore. Imagine, simple things like buying tomatoes became impossible. And the consequence of the terrible crisis that Venezuela has suffered, of shortages of things, not just of basic goods, but also electricity. In my house, we started losing power approximately once a week or more often sometimes, which you think, well, nothing happens if you lose power for a few hours a week. Actually does. Not just because of the inconvenience of being without electricity in that time, or internet, or those things, or even water, because you can't pump water up a building without electricity. But your devices, your electrical equipment goes bad. You will lose your fridge. You will lose your microwave. You will lose your oven. And what happens if you lose your fridge? You lose the food that then it's impossible to buy. And that happened to us. And it's a tragedy to lose your fridge and to lose your food. Not only because it's a horrible waste of food, but it's also because it's very difficult to replace. And because of that, when I finished high school in Venezuela, and I applied for colleges to come to the United States, and I got a full ride to start in Indiana, and I left by myself. And that's the last picture I took living in Venezuela. And it's a sad thing because Venezuela went from being a country of immigrants to a country of refugees. We went from being one of the nations that exported the most oil in the planet to being a nation that only exports people, not products or services. You can go to the next slide. And so the question here, and what I'm gonna try to talk to you today, is how does a country go from being wealthy to being poor? And why does that matter to us here? Why does the story of Venezuela matter to us? Venezuela not only has shortages now, not only does it have lack of electricity, lacks water. In my apartment complex, what happened was that my dad became the homeowners association president of the building, which meant that because we started running out of water, the utilities would not send us water randomly. We would have a communal tank of water where once water stopped coming from outside in the street, we had to ration our tank among the apartments. And my dad got to choose the times that we would ration it as the president of the homeowners association. So imagine that we went, Venezuela is a tropical country. It rains a lot, there are rivers, we have much more water per person than the United States. It's not a problem of lack of water because we are in the middle of a desert. Vegas doesn't have water shortages. It's a problem of administration of resources. And so it was a tragedy to have to ration water. It was a tragedy that sometimes things got so expensive because of inflation that I couldn't fit enough cash in my pockets. Like I just could not fit it in my pocket in my pant to pay for something at my school cafeteria. Like an empanada, which is something that's very common to buy in South America for lunch or for breakfast, whatever, would cost, just so many bills that you just couldn't carry it. And what I'm gonna try to convince you today is that there are three main reasons why this happened in Venezuela. And this is all tied to the lack of private property. Private property is this concept that you can own something, right? You own your house, you own books, you own the money that you carry, you own many things. In Venezuela, that changed in the last 25 years or so. So the first policy that changed this was nationalizations. Nationalizations is when the government comes and says, this is not your property anymore, now this is government property. The president of Venezuela would actually walk in the street, point at people's businesses and say, this is not yours anymore, now this is the government's property. If you had, say, an apartment that you rented to someone else, now that's not yours anymore, you're a greedy capitalist, so we're gonna take over your property. If you had a small business, say like one of my best friends, his grandma had a bookstore in downtown Caracas, and this was a lady that was in her 80s, and the president decided to walk in the street, point at her bookstore, and took over the bookstore of the 80-year-old lady. Farmers would lose their farms. The most famous case actually of nationalization in Venezuela was of a farmer who went on a hunger strike after the president took over his farm. His last name was Brito. And he died in the hunger strike. They didn't pay him a dime for his farm, and he lost his livelihood, so he preferred to die over the lack of his property. And what happens when the government takes over your business? What is your goal as a business owner? Do you guys sell something? Do you guys or have opened a business, or maybe you guys make something and then sell it to your friends? I don't know, food. I'm thinking, have you guys sold lemonade? Anybody here have sold something? What do you sell?
Once or twice when I was younger.
Yeah? What did you sell?
I think it was water bottles and cider.
Okay. Nice. Very cool. Anybody else? Yes?
I used to sell jewelry for a company called Paparazzi.
Nice. So what is your goal when you're selling these things?
Make money.
To make money. How do you make money?
By selling your products.
You sell it, and you have to sell it at a higher price than it costs you, right? Otherwise, you're not gonna break even and you're gonna lose money. You would never sell something for less than you would actually, that you bought it or it cost you to make. It would make no sense. Yet that's exactly what the Venezuelan government asked private businesses to do. After prices started going up in Venezuela, and I'll tell you why prices started going up and we had inflation, but after prices started going up, the government started blaming business owners for inflation because they're greedy and that's why they raise prices. And so what they did was, now we're gonna tell you how much you can charge for your goods and services. If you sell shoes in a store, the equivalent of the IRS of Venezuela would walk into your store and say 30% off. And if you're the business owner who's there and says, no, I'm not gonna just change my prices because you tell me by 30%. Oh, if you don't wanna give 30% off to the customers, I'm gonna take it for 100% off. You know, the government would come, take over all your merchandise and take it. And you would get paid nothing. So you had to comply. And this is what's called price controls. The government would put the price of all goods and services that were still private. You know, they didn't take over all businesses. They took over the large ones mostly, although some small ones as well. And then the ones that were still left, they would tell you how much you can charge for what you do. What happens if, say, you're a grocery store owner who sells bread in your store? What happens if it costs you $1 and the government tells you that you have to sell it at 50 cents? Would you keep selling it? No, because you would be losing money. So what happened was that all these businesses stopped selling all the things that the government told them how much it cost. And that's why we had to line up for bread. That's why we had to line up for, you know, toilet paper. That's why we had to line up for meat, because if there's no profit incentive, it doesn't get made. And that's the key here with private property. Capitalism and free enterprise, or as free enterprise is a better name, works because there's profit incentive. And profit is not a bad thing. Profit is a good thing. Because if something is profitable to do, more people will want to do it. And it's a signal. And then the question underlying all of this is, why was there such high inflation that the government started controlling the economy in the first place, right? Well, the high inflation was the government's fault in the first place. What they did was that when Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan dictator, came to power in 1999, the year I was born, the first things he did really was to say, you know, this is a rich country and we're gonna guarantee a lot of things that were not guaranteed before. We're gonna give people free housing, we're gonna give people free healthcare, of course, and free education. We're gonna give people free food, we're gonna give people free electricity, we're gonna give people free water, we're gonna give people free gasoline. Yes, free gasoline. The cost of gas in Venezuela was about 1 cent a gallon or less, like less than 1 cent, like really, not kidding, it's basically free. They should have just made it free because the cost of paying such a misery amount was greater than giving it away. And so somebody had to pay for all these things, right? Because if somebody is, say you have electricity in your house, who is gonna maintain the cables? Who's gonna fix things? Who's gonna pay the salaries of the workers at the electricity company? Somebody has to pay that. The government said, yes, we will pay for it. We're gonna print money to pay for it. First they said, no, we're gonna use the oil money to do it, but even that wasn't enough. So they started using the central bank, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve of the United States, to pay for things. And as they printed more money, things got more expensive. Not because the businesses got more greedy from one year to the other, but because the government changed the policies. Because when everything is free, nothing really is. That's the consequence of socialism. And I call these policies socialism. Why? Because socialism is the system defined by the founders of socialism, by their own philosophers, by Karl Marx, as government ownership of the means of production. Government ownership can come in many forms, like the nationalizations that they take it over. But effectively, if the government is telling you how much you charge for things, they basically own your business. So that's what happened. The government took over so many sectors of the economy that there was just no profit incentive, things got more expensive, and the consequence was that Venezuelans became poorer. And we went from being the richest nation in Latin America to the poorest nation in Latin America in a matter of 10 years or less. Now what's surprising, and you can pass the next slide. You can see this in this graph. This is the Economic Freedom Index. The Economic Freedom Index is a ranking developed by the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian think tank. But what they do is that they rank countries all over the world based on, do they have low taxes? Do they have balanced budgets and little debt? Do they regulate their economy a lot or not? Do they have stable money? You know, is there very high inflation or is there low inflation? And things like, you know, can you solve a contract dispute? Say that you don't get paid after you sign a contract. If you can go to a judge, hey, you know, this person is not, you know, following the terms of the law, the judge will act promptly and correctly. That's what the Fraser Institute tries to measure. And so if you're higher up in the ranking, it means that you are a freer country in some sense. You're a country that is less socialist and more capitalist. And if you're at the bottom, you're more socialist. Because socialism and capitalism don't really exist in a black or white switch. It's really a continuum, right? Where North Korea is in one end, where nobody owns anything. You don't even own your clothes, you don't own your house, you don't own anything at all. And perhaps on the other end would be something like Hong Kong or Singapore, where there's like basically no taxes, which is, you know, also the other end. So Venezuela went from being the 10th most capitalist country in the world in 1970 to being on 165th place in 2021. Now, the number of countries in the ranking was 166. So Venezuela went from being the 10th to the second to last in the ranking. If there has ever been an experiment of whether socialism works, it was this. Venezuela went from being from among the most capitalist to among the most socialist. And if socialism was ever going to work somewhere, it should have worked in the place that literally had free money flowing from the ground, which is oil. We literally had money coming up from the ground. They had money to give away from the oil industry, and even that was not enough. So let's go to the next one. Now, some people will blame other things for what happened to Venezuela, for the inflation, for the shortages. They will say, actually, that the oil industry is actually to blame. Because it's very common that if you are an oil-producing country, say the oil price goes down, your economy goes into crisis, right? Because you don't have enough money now to continue your previous standard of living. And they argue that Venezuela is not special because it's socialist. This is just what would have happened anyway because oil prices go down and up. And it's just too dependent on oil. Well, the question here is, why don't we see millions of people fleeing Saudi Arabia? Why don't we see millions of people fleeing Dubai? Why is Dubai one of the richest, wealthiest cities in the world where the people who are from Dubai like own Ferraris and Lamborghinis and, you know, are living the best life? These countries don't even have water. Like, these countries are in the middle of nowhere, deserts, no natural resources except oil. They can't plant anything and grow anything on farm. Venezuela is a tropical country. We say that if you throw a seed out the window, something will grow. Like, there are mango trees everywhere. That's actually helped people not finish the starvation that's going on because people would actually eat like bananas and mangoes from the street. But the point is that Venezuela has everything going for us. If it was the fault of the oil price going up and down, you would see people fleeing other oil-producing countries. Another excuse that people give is that Venezuela is a corrupt country. Certainly, it's a corrupt country, but they argue this is perhaps the most arrogant of the arguments for socialism. This is basically saying, if I had been in power, I would have done socialism right, because I would not have stolen money. The problem was that the people in power in Venezuela were crooks. They stole money. They're corrupt. I'm not corrupt. I'm sure that I would have done it well. And the answer to that is that, yes, of course they're crooks. Of course, they're murderers. They're not just crooks, they're murderers. They have actually killed people. They're drug dealers. Yet, that's not what makes Venezuela different. There are plenty of countries in the world that are corrupt and even ruled by drug dealers and terrorists even. One of the best examples is Iran. Iran is not only ruled by a terrorist government, Iran is also ruled by a religiously totalitarian government. In Iran, there was a recent case of a couple of 20-something-year-olds who filmed a video of themselves dancing in the street. Very romantic video. They are going to jail for 10 years for dancing in the street, a man and a woman, because that's illegal in Iran. It's illegal for women to have their hair uncovered in Iran, like you. That you would go to jail, you would get stoned and even killed for that in Iran. That doesn't happen in Venezuela, okay? Venezuela is not that totalitarian, it's certainly not religiously totalitarian. Yet, why aren't there millions of Iranians fleeing Iran? Because Iran, despite being corrupt, despite being religiously totalitarian, Iran is not a socialist country. In Iran, there is private property. In Iran, people don't starve to death because Iran is not socialist, Venezuela is. That's what makes Iran and Venezuela different. And the last argument that people make trying to defend what's happening in Venezuela as not being the fault of socialism is that it's actually the fault of the United States. Because they love to blame America for everything, of course. But the reality is the opposite, actually. Things have improved in Venezuela thanks to the United States, and let me tell you why. They argue that because Venezuela has been sanctioned by the US government, the population can't survive. And so the question here is, okay, it's true, Venezuela has been sanctioned, but what are the sanctions? The sanctions are against the people who work for the government. Say that you want to buy something from somebody who works for the government, that's illegal. You would actually be accused of a crime in the United States for that, like money laundering. You could go to jail for doing something like that. But if you want to send money, food, medicine, anything to a Venezuelan who is not part of the government, like, the 90%, 95%, 99% of the population, you can do that right now. There are even companies that ship things from the United States house to house in Venezuela. And people send unlimited amounts of money to Venezuela that they can. In fact, that's how the people that are left, the 20-something million left in the country, still survive. Because there are 7.1 million of us outside sending money in. That's the only reason they haven't died. So it's not the sanctions. The sanctions are actually to stop corrupt people from profiting from the US free market system. There were people who had stolen billions of dollars in Venezuela from the oil industry and from drug trafficking who owned complete buildings in the city of Miami. They owned entire buildings, they owned yachts, and what happened was that the United States said, we're not gonna allow this from human rights violators and we're gonna take that over. And you know what? I support that. We need more of that. We need to do more of that. Now, imagine that, well, that did something to Venezuela indirectly. There are other countries that are sanctioned by the United States. Perhaps the best example is the one I already used. It's Iran. Iran is so sanctioned that you can't even send a piece of mail. You can't even travel. They will put you on a watch list if you travel to Iran, okay? Venezuela has no such problem. You can send money, you can send food. So why is Iran the country most sanctioned in the world? Why is, perhaps Sudan or perhaps other sanctioned countries, even Russia, who is sanctioned and also an oil-producing country. Why aren't there millions of people fleeing those countries, and why are there millions of people fleeing Venezuela? Because what makes Venezuela different is that Venezuela is a socialist country, and those countries are not. But perhaps the reason that this is more important for you is that Venezuela is the only socialist country in history that elected its way into socialism. Venezuela is not China or Cuba or the USSR, where there were violent revolutions, civil wars, and even invasions of other countries like in Eastern Europe that transformed them into socialist economies. The Polish people did not elect to become socialist after World War II. The Soviets invaded them. The Russian people did not elect Lenin. There was a revolution and millions of people died. The Chinese people did not elect Chairman Mao. He killed 60 million people, the largest genocide in world history, by the way, that is not taught for most people. The largest genocide. The Venezuelan people did elect Hugo Chavez in 1998, December. And so the question is, if that can happen to Venezuela, a democracy, a country with a lot of oil, that is very, that a nation of immigrants, then why can't it happen anywhere else? Because if socialism will ever come to the United States, it won't come because there's a violent revolution. It will come because people were ignorant enough to vote for those people into power. You can pass the next slide. So this is a picture of Venezuela today, of people eating garbage in the street. And when I'm talking about people eating trash, I don't mean people who might be mentally ill, who have some problem of that sort, like became homeless because of that reason, because they have PTSD or something like that. No, these are normal families who sometimes go, the mom with the husband and the children, to eat together in the trash, because that's what people were left to. The next one. And so let me give you some examples of why this actually is a risk to the United States. Go to the next slide. This is an article from 2013, written in the leftist magazine Salon, titled Hugo Chavez's Economic Miracle. In 2013, Venezuela had over 50% inflation. The United States has never experienced what 50% inflation looks like. Not any year in US history since the independence, okay? Maybe before in colonial times, I don't know, maybe 300 years. 50% was in 2013. Now, 50% looks really like nothing today, because now we have 1,000,000% inflation. So you understand what 1,000,000% is, because that's impossible to really imagine. 1,000,000% basically means that the price of things doubles every week. So imagine that you go buy a bottle of water that costs $1 today, next week is $2, next week is $4, next week is $8, $16, $32, $64, and so on. By the end of the year, it's thousands of dollars. And so that's what Venezuela has become. And this man said that that situation where there were shortages, there was high inflation, that is an economic miracle for him. I can only assume that if you think that that is an economic miracle, you want that economic miracle for the United States, right? Because who wouldn't want an economic miracle for their own country? Now, let's see who this person was. The next slide. This man, his name is David Sirota. David was the main campaign advisor and speechwriter for Bernie Sanders in the 2020 presidential campaign. So, this is a man who almost becomes president of the United States, and who is currently, Bernie Sanders, by the way, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which is the committee that drafts the budget of the United States. Now, this man right here, his name is Chesa Boudin. Chesa Boudin is the son of 2 terrorists convicted. His father is still in jail, and his mother recently passed away, who tried to kill students at Columbia University in New York City, where I go to school. He's not to fault for the crimes of his parents, right? But this is a man who became the district attorney of San Francisco. District attorney is the position that accuses people of crimes when they violate the law. Say you commit murder, you rob a store. District attorney is the one that files charges against you in the court. Well, he was also followed the footsteps of his parents, and let me tell you what these are 2 of the books he wrote. One is called Venezuelan Revolution, 100 Questions, 100 Answers. And my favorite one, Gringo, A Coming of Age in Latin America. Well, this gringo, how he called himself, was the translator of Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, who destroyed my country. And he became the district attorney of the city of San Francisco. He was so radical that even the people of San Francisco had to recall him 2 years after electing him, okay? Even the most Democrat city in the United States, they couldn't stand him, because he actually stopped accusing people of all the crimes. Like, nobody who committed robbery was getting, in jail. If you don't file charges, then what happens? You don't go to jail. And so nobody was going to jail in San Francisco, and everybody got things stolen. And this is not, unlike what happened in Venezuela. Venezuelans not only suffered, we didn't only suffer from the economic consequences of socialism, we had a much more terrible model, where the murder rate started increasing drastically after Chavez became president. Caracas, the city where I'm from today, is in the top 10 of the cities with the highest murder rates in the planet, and has been in that list for over a decade. So that you get how many people get killed in Venezuela each year, approximately 1 out of every 1,000 persons gets murdered. Just murder. I'm not talking starvation or lack of medicine and you die in the hospital, something like that. No. Just homicide, usually with guns. In a country where, of course, guns are prohibited. And this is what happens. Kidnapping is very common, My family had to make up a story and tell me ever since I was a kid, this is what you're gonna say we do. You're not gonna tell people that we own a gas station, which is what they did for a living. You're gonna say these other stories so that they don't try to, ask for more money than we can actually pay them, the kidnappers, to rescue you. There was a new type of crime that came up, which was called express kidnapping. It's called express because it's all within 24 hours, and it's a business model. They're not actually psychopaths. Well, I mean, I guess that to do that, you have to be mentally ill to some extent, but they're not really there because they are bloodthirsty, okay? They're there for the money, and if you pay them, they'll release you because they know that there are no legal consequences in Venezuela. Nobody will go to jail for the crime, so they're not really afraid of the police. Usually, actually, it's the police who is also the criminals. So this is where this man learned, and now he became an American politician. The next slide. And there are organizations in this country, such as the Democratic Socialists of America, that have over 100,000 members, 100,000 US citizens who are members of this organization, that you'd say, well, they just are misguided, right? Misguided. Let's see. This is who the Democratic Socialists of America was meeting with in the summer of 2021, around Independence Day, while everybody here was celebrating Independence Day, COVID's gonna be over. In Venezuela, the leaders of the Democratic Socialists of America were handshaking and, fist bumping the dictator of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. And this is not a picture I made up. This is a picture that they themselves published in their social media, very proud of their achievement. By the way, Maduro is a man that is sought by the Department of Justice in the US and by the Drug Enforcement Administration and has a $10 million price on his head. This is one of the most wanted people in the world. And these are US citizens traveling to a foreign country to meet with one of the people in the most wanted list who have no consequences and who want to run for office and take over this country. And the concerning part is that if you were to tell that and show that to any American, I think that 90% of the population would say, I would never vote for these people. I don't endorse a dictator of a foreign country. How would I do that? But the problem here is that these people are really good at camouflage and at trying to lie about what their true intentions are. Instead of saying that they want to turn America into Venezuela, they say, we just want to turn America into something more like Denmark, like Sweden, like Norway. We just want Nordic socialism. That's not what socialism is. Socialism just means free things, good things. What a beautiful word, socialism. It's social, right? Well, the problem with the example of the Nordic countries is that despite that being their promise, it's really a myth. The Nordic countries aren't really socialist. And what they do is very different from what the politicians claim they do. So let me give you some examples of why we should actually be like the Nordic countries, just not in the way you think. For example, all these Nordic countries that are supposedly socialist have lower taxes on their corporations than the United States. You would think, based on things like what Senator Bernie Sanders has said, that these are countries where the rich get all their money taken over by the government to redistribute for the poor. Well, the corporations pay lower taxes. I guess that's why we have IKEA and Lego and all these other companies that come from those countries, by the way. Let's go to the next. What else? The average worker. So this is the worker making the average wage in each of these countries. So usually, you know, somebody in the middle class, really. What's the average tax rate they pay as a share of their income? It's actually higher in all those countries than in the United States. They pay much more in taxes. It's not the corporations or the rich people that pay high taxes in the Nordic countries. It's the average person. It's the opposite of the United States. Maybe we are the socialist ones, not them. And not only that, these are countries that run balanced budgets. All these countries have much lower debt than the United States as a share of their economy. I have never heard a socialist in the United States say that we need to balance the budget. No, they want to spend more. They want to get in debt. And then they want to pay the debt, of course. But this is what these countries do, regardless of whether we support it or not. And this is a picture of me back in 2017, the last time I visited, in Venezuela. You see that pack of cash that I have there? That is the price of a movie ticket. That is a movie ticket. And that is not like $1 bills, okay? That's like the largest denomination bill. Imagine you had a pack of $100 like that, of all these bills of $100. So you would have thousands in your hand. That's the price of one movie ticket. So when I was telling you the story that I couldn't fit enough cash in my pocket to buy an empanada, that's what I meant with cash and fitting it. And so what's my goal with telling you this about the Nordic countries and about Venezuela and inflation? My goal is telling you that back in the 90s and in the early 2000s, even after Chavez got elected, even the people who opposed Chavez, even in my family who never voted for him, said that, you know, we never thought that it would be this bad, okay? Even the people who opposed Chavez never thought that it would come to, like, we would starve to death. But it did. And the motto that people used to say was, you know, Venezuela is an oil-producing country. We're not an island. We will never be like Cuba. Venezuela is not Cuba. Venezuela is a democratic country. Venezuela is a nation with a history of democracy. Venezuela has oil. How could we become like Cuba? And the truth is that 25 years later, we didn't only become like Cuba. We became worse than Cuba. We're the ones subsidizing Cuba. We're colonized by Cuba, basically, now. And now the saying is not that Venezuela will never be like Cuba. The saying is we were rich, but we didn't know it. Because that could only happen in a democratic country because people were ungrateful enough to vote for someone and to be envious of others and think that he's going to take from the rich to give to me. So I'm going to vote for him to take away somebody else's property instead of working for it. And there might have been problems in Venezuela. Of course there were problems. But now there's many more problems. And so the question in the United States here now is that we're being told the United States will never be like Venezuela. We're too rich. We have a 200+ year history of democracy. How could we ever become like Venezuela? Well, let me tell you, we can become worse than Venezuela. If the same policies are implemented, the same results are going to happen. It's not science, you know, it's not rocket science economics, really. It's very simple. And that's why you guys are so important. Because when you go on to college, you're going to be told things like I was told. You know, I came to college, the first thing I came to do in the United States was come to college. And one of the first exercises they made us do was something called a walk of privilege, where if you were a woman, you had to take a step back. If you were a man, you had to take a step forward. If you were white, you had to take a step ahead. If you were black, you had to take a step back. And so on with many other characteristics. And the goal of these things is the same goal that the socialists had in Venezuela 25 years ago, is to divide the population and to say, you see, there is a privileged class that we have to tear down. And the reason the poor are poor is because the rich are rich, when that's not really the case. In fact, the reason we have a lot of poverty is because we actually have a lot of government restrictions that makes us poor. We have things like in the United States, I was talking with an asylum seeker family in New York City that got there. This guy from Colombia, he was a barber in Colombia. He wanted to find a job. Guess what? The government doesn't let him work. Why? Because you need a barber's license to cut hair. So he can't work. So is it the rich fault that he's poor? No, it's the government's fault that he's poor. And when we talk to people and hear the stories, it's the same theme. So my challenge to you is that the next time that you guys go with your parents to the grocery store, say, or to the pharmacy or to any store, and you see what's around you, you see that the lights turn on, you see that the faucet in your bathroom, when you open it, water comes out, you think to yourself, wow, I am so blessed to live in America, a free country, and a country that we must preserve. And the only way to preserve it is to begin being grateful of the things we have. So that you never have to go to the grocery store. You never have to say things like what we say in Venezuela, which is that we were rich, but we didn't know it. I hope that you guys never have to say that. So thank you so much for your time. Okay? Now, if you guys have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Yes?
Is there any way that Venezuela could go back to the way it was?
Yes, look, any country can, if implementing the right policies, if rolling back the socialist policies that they implemented, for sure it can go back, and it can be much better. Think of Poland, think of the Baltic countries, think of the Czech Republic, think of Romania, Hungary, all the Eastern European countries that used to be socialist economies. After the Berlin Wall fell, after they gained independence, now these countries are growing really fast, they're really rich, and all happened within a couple decades. So it can happen. It's not going to be a thing that's going to happen in 1 year, because unfortunately it's much easier to destroy than it is to build. But it can happen.
How much of the stuff, like in Venezuela, could you get local?
Local. Increasingly less, and that's simple, right? Because the government destroyed our productive capacity. So if the government took over the companies that produce, say, milk, which is an example, and those companies stopped producing because, and I didn't mention this before, but let me give you the best example. When I was telling you that if you have a business, your goal is to profit, right? But what is the government's goal when they have a business? The government's goal when they buy a business is to maximize votes, right? At least that's what it is when there's some form of election or democracy, even if they're going to end up becoming authoritarian. Because now there's no democracy anymore in Venezuela. It started democratically and it ends being authoritarian. But the point initially was that the government took over these companies, and how did they maximize votes? They hire more people than they need. I gave you a job, now you vote for me. And I lower the price of the things that we sell. Look how good, I'm helping the poor, I'm lowering the price of milk. Well, the company goes broke, and then everybody gets fired, and nobody produces milk anymore. So instead of having expensive milk, now we have no milk. And instead of having some workers, now we have no workers. And that's what happened with state-owned enterprises. Because of that, what was, if you wanted to buy milk, the only things that you could buy it from was abroad. So are we good? Sorry, yeah. So you basically, because the government took over the domestic companies, the only companies left to buy things from were foreign companies. Yeah, you had a question.
What are the limitations for Christianity?
The limitations for Christianity. So the limitations are mostly related to how politically active churches become. So, for example, there have been many priests in Venezuela who have been killed, or some churches that have been burned. And there's a very famous priest from Maracaibo in western Venezuela who, they broke his legs in many parts. And he ended up fleeing, and now he lives in the United States. But that's mostly become, not necessarily because they are Catholic or the religion they profess, but more so because they are leaders in their communities. and because of, and they became very outspoken against the government. And so it's more so a lack of free speech than a lack of religious freedom. I do know that, for example, the Mormon church has a lot of problems in Venezuela, even though there's not many Mormons, but you know, they send missionaries and all these things, and they do get persecuted. But that's pretty much it.
So do they like, so if the person who was elected, then when he got elected, did people ever try to get rid of him?
Yes. There was actually an attempt to overthrow Chavez 3 years after he came to power in 2002. The military actually successfully overthrew him for one day, and then he came back. And after he came back, it began a political purge where the Minister of Communications, there was then a referendum, you know, he came back to power and to do the recall referendum in Venezuela. You had to gather signatures, and there were several million people who signed, including my family. And the Minister of Communications published it all on a list online, the list of all the people who signed, their identities, and doxed them with their ID number, their address. And then all of those people in that list, which became known as the Tascon list, because that's the last name of the minister who published it on his own website, we were all barred from receiving welfare benefits forever and working in the government. And then the president went on live TV, firing by name each one of the people who weren't on strike against the government, and fired them by name, thousands. So this took several days of him just being on live TV firing people. And so there was a complete purge of the military, complete purge of the bureaucracy, complete purge of schools, and the military became a Marxist indoctrinated organization that served the interest of the regime after that. And so, yeah, that's what happened.
Is it pretty hard to get out of Venezuela into America?
Now it's much harder for several reasons. One of the reasons is that the government started not wanting to issue passports to people. And so now basically the only way to get a passport is to bribe someone. You know, at the end, this is Latin America, this is not Eastern Europe. Everything can get solved by bribing someone. It's the truth. It's a different style of socialism, right? It's not like the Chinese socialism, not like the Russian socialism. It's the Latin American version. So a bribe here and there works. The problem is that it's a very expensive bribe, and it's very expensive for the population. You know what I'm talking about. You're laughing. And so it's a few $1,000s to get a passport in a country where the average salary per month is $100 a month now. So that's very difficult. And so the consequence is that most Venezuelans who have left are living by foot to Colombia. So the people who said that Venezuela is not Cuba because we're not an island, they were right. It's easier to escape. We don't have to take a boat. We can just take a walk. And so that's what happened. And so there are about 2.5 million Venezuelans in Colombia, and there's about 1.5 million in Peru. And then there's a few million spread all over the world, including in the United States, where there are several 100,000. Yeah.
So how did the military system work in Venezuela?
Well, Venezuela used to be a U.S. ally before Chavez. You know, like there were, you know, Nixon went to Venezuela, Richard Nixon. Communists tried to kill him even then, by the way. It was a rough visit. But the presidents of Venezuela came to the United States to meet. The military was a neutral organization, even, you know, because Latin America has a long history of military dictatorships. There was always that fear. And so actually under the Constitution, if you served in the military, you were actually barred from political participation and voting even. Which is not something that we do in the United States, but in Venezuela, that was like the fear, like the military should not be involved in politics, basically. Because Venezuela was actually the only democracy in South America at several points in the 20th century, because all the other countries were military dictatorships, right-wing dictatorships, actually. Brazil was, Argentina was, Peru, Chile, Colombia maybe not as much, but certainly ruled by cartels. And so we were actually the nice country in the region. So all the refugees came to Venezuela. And so now it's the other way around. And so the military was just a professional organization. Chavez was actually in the military, the dictator. He used to be a lieutenant. And he was always had this agenda of taking over the country. In 1992, he attempted a coup with members of his division. He failed in that coup in 1992, and he went to jail. He killed people on live TV, and this is the person that then people voted for. And he went to jail, and the president after the one that he gave the coup unsuccessfully to, won in even though he was not really a leftist, he won with the support of very different many parties. And basically to buy the support of the far left parties to win the election, he promised them that he would release the quote-unquote political prisoners of the coup, which were not really political prisoners. And he pardoned Chavez, a presidential pardon, and that's how Chavez was able to get elected after. Which is actually a very similar story to Hitler. Hitler attempted a coup in Germany, in Bavaria. He went to jail. And after he got out of jail, he won an election, and that's what happened in Venezuela. And you'd wonder, what leads a population to vote for somebody like that, right? Because it's not like he came out of nowhere. We knew that he had committed crimes. And I think that what happened was, I mentioned that the resentment that was happening in Venezuela, the lack of understanding why there was poverty that now looks like nothing because there was poverty, there was no hunger, right? Here in the United States, people say that there's poverty. The average per person in the United States has a car and internet connection, okay? That's not poverty in Latin America, that's the middle class. So it's that, it's that lack of perspective, and I don't know what can I tell you. I don't think I would ever vote for somebody who killed anyone, no matter what their ideology was, if I agreed with all their proposals.
Wyatt, you good back there? Okay. And if you have a question, you can ask them, okay? I'm sure I'll give you an answer there. But thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Daniel, for coming out and being with us today. So you guys do what you need to, but come on up and ask your question.